Hi, I'm Ashima. Before we start the discussion, as I'm a photographer, I'm not a scientist, I just thought it would be good for you to know why I'm here at all, which is because I actually do work with environmental issues. Most of the stuff that I do is actually to do with social justice and issues around water equality rather than quality. But I thought it might be a good launching point for many people to actually understand the visual landscape of many of these themes that we are going to speak about. So I don't want to take too much time. I have 4 minutes, so I'm going to race through this. Okay, technology is great. Where do I point this? It's not moving. Yeah. Okay, no, I'll just do it from here. Sorry. This was a story that I did on weavers, and I just thought this is a good example to start with because these are handloom weavers in Varanasi, and they are stretched in every which way due to poverty. And so they work right through the night, or they work whenever they get electricity because they have a lack of infrastructure. They work in open fields with goats and garbage, making these wonderful saris. They bathe in a highly polluted river when they are already stretched in every way, which can only lead to often diseases like TB. It makes them very susceptible, and then what happens is that they're living in highly crowded situations, or they're constantly in touch with people. There's no isolation ever. I did a story also on indoor air pollution, and again, this is just to show you that there are always certain sections of society that become much more vulnerable to disease, like women and children, because they are the ones who are always in contact. As you can see, just from the lines in the community rural hospitals, it'll usually just be women and children who are there. So water collection, I think, as most people will know, is gendered. You can just see, like, the mother will be carrying this water and her young sons will just be sitting and playing on the mobile phone. This you see pretty much throughout India, whether you're rural or water collection is a woman's job. And this is just to show you like the difficulty. This woman has to walk 2 kilometers to get to the well from her house, through the kichad, through the ganneka field, to the well, again through the kichad. This is how they carry water. And the other thing that people don't think about often is that, okay, well, it's very hard for women also to collect water, but it's when you think about also people who have any kind of physical challenges, when they have to collect water. So I had done a story also on how rural disability works, like how do you actually go to the toilet when you're... And this young, frail mother has to carry a bucket of water and her child to the toilet. This is also then just about how many people are trying to get access to very limited water. This is in a tribal school in Madhya Pradesh. And these are community stories, and I think these are really important to know, is that how now, because women are the ones who are always impacted by water, and now they are really trying to take control in a lot of rural areas. So they are being taught how to actually test the quality of water. And then they show the other women. And then they make maps of their village out of rangoli. And they map out all the water bodies. And they put marks, they put big red X's on which are the ones that shouldn't be used. So it tells you that don't use this water body because you will get pelia. This is another community initiative, which was in Myanmar, and how basically they've had so many cyclones where they've been really devastated, and they realized it was because they were cutting down all their mangroves for firewood and charcoal. And so they've created a community project where they are reforesting, but for mangroves, which is great which is like a huge combatant for climate change because they sequester so much carbon. So this was sort of like a portrait-driven story that I had done. And that's really, I just wanted to show you some of these things. This is seagrass. So if you think mangroves are good for carbon sequestration, seagrasses are like 5 times better. So they're trying to do a lot of work in trying to understand that. And that's where I'll stop, and the lights can come on. And I would like to call the panelists onto the stage now, please. Thank you. Thanks. So as a photographer, my job is to tell stories. And so what we do often is we look at the science that people write about, and we try and find an emotional way to connect all these different things that you're talking about and create a narrative. And when I was speaking to Rashneh before this event, she also spoke of the need to make these links and these connections much clearer so people understand the consequences of their actions. So really, let's just dive straight in. And let's talk about the situation in Delhi, the public health emergency. Rashneh, would you please connect all these dots on this situation, please?
Okay, so I think the Delhi air pollution crisis is a very good example of how our lives are so closely intertwined with the ramifications of global warming and climate change. So very often, when we speak about the Delhi air pollution problem, it is seen as a direct outfall of stubble burning in Punjab and Haryana. It's because stubble is being burnt, Delhi gets polluted. But how many of us have thought, why was this not happening 20 years ago, 30 years ago? Have we started looking and connecting the dots? So if we go back a few years, how many of us know that India's groundwater table has decreased by over 61% in the past 10 years? And this is true even for Haryana and Punjab, which has been suffering from extremely low groundwater table levels and surface water supply. So in 2009, a law was actually enacted in Punjab that prevents farmers from planting rice until mid-June. So what happens now is that they can start planting paddy only in mid-June, as a result of which they need to have a very quick turnover cycle. So they need to get their field ready for the winter crop of wheat. Now, because that time period between the two crops has been decreased, the fastest way is to burn the stubble overnight, because removing the stubble takes time. It's a very labor-intensive process, time-consuming process, and with that window having been shortened by law, they just burn the fields overnight. So now we start connecting the dots where we realize that Delhi's air pollution level is connected with our groundwater table, is connected with surface water. If you go back and look at the changes in the monsoon cycle, I mean, sitting here in Maharashtra, I don't need to say more, where the monsoon has become so unpredictable that it's actually affecting food supply and food security. So in a state like Maharashtra, last year at this very same time, the price of onions was 20 rupees a kilo. Today, because the crop has been affected, we can see that the prices have skyrocketed to 120 rupees a kilo. What happens then? The poor cannot afford fresh fruits, vegetables, pulses that will, of course, have a direct impact on their health. If you look at rural India, very often the extremely poor mothers are dipping glucose biscuits in water and giving it to children. And that is what they term as nutritious, because they do not have access. So then you start connecting the dots between Delhi's air pollution, groundwater table, unpredictable rainfall pattern, which is affecting our age-old agricultural practices. You then move on to nutrition, which has a direct impact on health. So we really now need to start connecting the dots.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Nerges, we all know that air pollution is detrimental to our health, but can you explain this at a broader level? And what does this mean for us as a society?
Yeah, so you talked about air pollution, Ashima. So I'll start with that, but I just want to say that I don't want to restrict myself to air pollution because there are 5 different types of pollution that actually affect our health. And of course, air is breath, and breath is life. You know, life starts when we take in our first breath. And with that first breath, 25 trillion red blood cells in the body actually supply 95% of the energy to a human being. Yeah, only 10% or 5 to 10% comes from food and water. Yeah, 95% is through the air that's absorbed through breathing. So in that sense, air is free, so perhaps it sort of took a backseat. So water scarcity and food scarcity sort of hit the headlines first before air pollution became a topic of interest. So this is what I wanted to say. So I'll look at the other pollutants, but I'd like to just say 2 things in terms of a general aspect of pollution. There is traditional pollution for burning of wood and dung and so on. And there is modern pollution coming out from recent industrial processes and technology that has been developed. And this is all pervasive. It's a class-agnostic pollution. The rich and the poor are both equally affected by pollution. The poor more so because their ability to mitigate its effects is much lesser. And 6 out of 10 of the world's most polluted cities are in India. That's well known. I think the newspapers have carried it. So the chemical pollution comes from things like vehicle emulsions, coal burning, diesel generators, roadside dust, as we know it, and of course industrial byproducts. And chemical pollution is normally sort of divided in 2 parts. The particulate matter, as we call it, and they are of different sizes. They have a 2.5 micron thing and a 10 and so on. And then you have the gaseous pollution and the chemical pollution, which also has a lot of side effects. Now, within the chemical pollutants, there is also a class of pollutants that we call endocrine disruptors. And these are structures of chemicals that are very similar to human hormones. And they actually, when they get inside the human body, they mimic hormones, and then they just disrupt all the metabolic processes, and you'll end up with a whole variety of diseases. Pesticides like endosulfans, which are used prolifically in the cashew nut fields in Kerala, are also great health pollutants. We talk little about biological pollutants, and that comes largely from fecal sludge that actually pollutes. So you should know that about 4,000 towns in India have about 7.9 million people who actually defecate in the open and pollute the ground with these biological pollutants. And there are various ways in which they manifest themselves. People who come into touch with these biological pollutants are open to molecules like endotoxin, as we call it. It's a type of, when the bacteria lyses, they release a chemical called endotoxin, a protein called endotoxin, which sets your whole immune system into a disarray and creates all sorts of inflammatory diseases. Not very much is known about that, but we do know about more waterborne diseases like Shigella or Enterocoli and so on, which cause diarrheas and dysenteries and, of course, helminthic infections. The third type of pollution you have is electronic pollution, and India has about something like 4.1 million tons of electronic pollution, and that comes all from your mobile phones. All of you have mobile phones here, so you're polluting in a way when the phones get recycled and so on. And they have things like mercury and acids and heavy metals like arsenic, nickel, cadmium, and chromium. The fourth type of pollution, which is just about getting recognized as a serious problem, is sound pollution. Crackers, horns of vehicular traffic, and so on. And the fifth type of pollution I'd just like to touch upon is medical pollution. And what is medical pollution? Medical pollution is when antibiotics are produced in large numbers, and then they're not consumed in the volume that was anticipated, and then they're dumped straight into river bodies and environment and so on. And they cause this problem of antimicrobial resistance, which is a major challenge before the world today. In terms of the particulate matter, which is what most people sort of like to talk about, the smaller the particle, the worst. So PM 2.5 is much worse, and even worse than 2.5 is in a particle what we call nanoparticles, which are even very much smaller than that. And they're the ones that not only just get into the lungs and cause inflammation, but the nanoparticles actually can get into the bloodstream and cause a whole heap of disorders. Now, what are the types of consequences on society in terms of this pollution? So one thing is India is faced with a huge barrage of premature deaths, that is deaths in the younger age group and less. So we have about 50% of deaths as premature and 20% in the West. So we have a larger number of premature deaths. And most of these, about 50% of those deaths are caused by what we call chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and diseases like TB. Then, of course, next in line, you have the lung cancers. Then you have the ischemic heart diseases and hypertension. And then you have strokes. So we have a double whammy from this, both from non-communicable disease side as well as the communicable disease side. And children, as Ashima quite rightly pointed out, and even Bunty, are most susceptible to these pollutions. One is children are smaller, so they get the pollution much quicker than taller adults. And children, 14% have asthma between the ages of 5 and 17 years in India. And also they have childhood cancers and developmental deformities. So another one is, of course, the air pollution causes a blockage of vitamin D, which we get from sunlight. And that's something that actually also does not help too much in the stimulation of our immunity. When you have vitamin D deficiencies or insufficiencies, you're unable to mount a good immune response. So these are some of the points. And of course, the most important is the intergenerational problems, the health problems that can arise. And that is air pollution with less oxygen can damage sperm quality. And this has been a lot of studies coming out from Delhi's IVF clinics and so on and the thing. And particulate matter, gases like nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide also cause miscarriages. They also cause low birth weight and a high degree of stillbirths in women. So women bear a unproportionate or disproportionately larger share of problems in pollution, as you also rightly pointed out. And in terms of the premature deaths and the cost of healthcare, everyone knows that 80% of healthcare in India is out of pocket, so the healthcare costs are enormous, second only to dowry. And I'll just give one example in India. So pulmonary rehabilitation centers, which are required for battling air pollution effects in terms of emphysema or COPD, there are 36 such centers in New York. And the cost per episode of treatment in these centers is about 15,000 rupees, Indian rupees. Whereas if you go to just 5 pulmonary rehabilitation centers, which are in Mumbai, largely all private centers, an episode of treatment, in contrast, is 1 lakh, over 1 lakh. So this is the disparity that you have to face in terms of paying for. You have the highest amount of pollution, but you also have to have the highest amount of cost for treatment. I'll end here, and then we can carry on.
Can I just ask, why is it so high here? Sorry, it's not directly, but I just want to know.
I think it's got to do with probably sort of a devious costing of the whole procedure that's required in terms of the technology that's required. So basically, I think costing of healthcare is extremely iffy in India.
Okay.
I think the costing is not done according to what really is the cost. Yeah. There are other considerations.
So you have just listed so many things that can happen with the changing environment and pollution, but it still seems like a lot of people don't actually take climate change seriously, and therefore they don't take the health risks seriously. So can you comment on this, please?
Sure. I think there are about 5 or 7 reasons why climate change is not taken seriously, or people still disbelieve. There is a group of people, perhaps it's decreasing every day, but still a considerable group of people do not believe in climate change that's actually happening, and therefore they refute even the health risks that are associated. And I think here we are using the term climate change and pollution related health a little synonymously. There is a slight difference, but nevertheless, I'll just say why climate change is actually refuted. So one is, of course, the fossil fuel industry, media moguls, and political lobbyists, 30 years of sowing doubts, yeah? And they lobby at about, the finances are about $200 million a year, I think. And also there is a term which they use now called climate sadism, which is attacking people who actually espouse for climate change and its mitigation. And particularly they've been attacking this Greta Thunberg. The second one, I think, is science denial. They just feel that, we don't really trust the scientists to come up with these models and so on. This is a scientific conspiracy. These are just natural cycles of climate change, which the Earth has been facing for a long time. But of course, I think we have to realize that there is a lot of robustness in the scientific studies, and all of them are more or less coming along to the same conclusions. Then, of course, they shift the debate from science to cost. How much will it take to actually fix all these things of climate change, and that climate change fixing is costly. So basically, the argument is, from economists, particularly of the IMF, it says it takes 1% of global GDP to actually, which is now 86, followed by 12 zeros. The mathematicians can say what that is. Yeah, 86 trillion. And it grows at about 3% annually. The global GDP. So the sum is really trivial if you're to spend 1% of that huge amount. So in fact, subsidizing supply of fossil fuels costs the world 6% of its global GDP. So in a sense, climate change is not that expensive to mitigate. Then the fourth one is just humanitarian denial. CC is good. Climate change is good, actually. It allows temperate farmers to grow more crops and so on. But people use carbon dioxide as a fertilizer for the soil, the released carbon dioxide emissions. And that to some extent is true. Now, the biosphere absorbs 20% of carbon dioxide pollution, and another 25% is absorbed by the oceans. So, however, deforestation and ocean pollution nullifies that effect completely. And people forget that in 2010, when there were extreme heat waves in Russia, nearly over 15,000 people were killed, and the entire wheat crop of Russia was destroyed. And the Black Sea today is a major focus of discussion, with about 100 kilometers of the Black Sea completely polluted with microplastic and up to a depth of 2 kilometers. And the last one is political denial. Who is going to make the first move? Now, that we've been seeing in the Times of India in the last couple of days with the Minister of Environment's comments about the fact. So it's a crisis denial, really, in a way. So who makes the first move? Of course, we are big emitters, but relatively, the US and the EU are the major emitters of carbon dioxide. And China. And we're a small portion. We're large in terms of 7%, but per capita, our load is small. So I think this is something that we need to realize.
Yeah. And if I could add, I think I'd like to make it clear that there isn't a single peer-reviewed scientific paper that disputes climate change. It might be popular science, it might be newspaper articles that are constantly talking about it, but there isn't a single peer-reviewed paper. And I think a lot of individuals do not take climate change seriously at a personal level because the effects are not immediate. It is something out there. If you fall ill today, it's possibly because of some biological virulent, but it's not because of climate change, again, because they haven't thought it through. I don't think people realize the impact today. And nobody is looking at the long term. Nobody, not governments, not political parties, are looking at long-term planning. Are we really thinking what's going to happen 50 years down the line? Are we thinking about our policies and development models 100 years down the line? So I do not think that urgency is there today.
That's right.
Which sort of ties into the next question that I would like to ask you, is that, weather patterns are changing. There's a lot of and around the country, so more and more people are flocking to urban centers. So, can you shed some light on what this sort of strain means to a finite amount of land that's available?
So in India today, if you look at the UN World Urbanization Prospect of 2018, today 34% of India lives in urban cities. 34%. And this has been a 3% rise in the past 7 years, as per the 2011 report. And when you talk about urbanization is not only where our cities are constantly expanding, but it's also a process of where there is a lot of migration from rural India and rural pockets to our cities for a number of reasons. And that would also include permanent and temporary climate refugees. So there is urbanization that's happening. As you rightly mentioned, if you look at our finite resources, land is a finite resource. Fresh water is a finite resource. And what are these cities doing? It is constantly urbanizing, expanding. And being in Mumbai, possibly if we have time, talk about one case study. And let's look at the case study of Dhanu. It is a small taluka, approximately 125 kilometers north of Mumbai. It is one of our last green lungs. So on one side, you've got Mumbai to the south, and in the north, you've got the Vapi entire industrial belt. And Dhanu has been declared as being ecologically fragile in 1991. It was declared as one of 3 areas in India to have been given the special notification. For the last many decades, there have been court battles galore to protect and conserve it, because it is the fruit and vegetable basket of Maharashtra. It is one of the main fish breeding sites of the western coast of India. But today, if you look at Dhanu, because Bombay is bludgeoning, it's just growing at its seams, the thermal power plant was put up in Dhanu as an exception, and it is a coal-based thermal power plant, which used to be BSES, became Reliance, became Adani. It is the thermal power plant that is supplying electricity to all of suburban Mumbai. So Mumbai gets lit up as a Christmas tree. The pollution is happening in a rural taluka. Air pollution is happening there, water pollution is happening there, and that taluka still has over 5 hours of electricity cuts. So that is happening in Dhanu. Now what happens is, Western Railways, because the city is expanding, Virar and all can't be the last barrier. We need to expand further. So Dhanu has become the last station on the Western Railways local line. And this happened in 2013. And you should see the sort of development that has suddenly exploded over there. So the old rambling bungalows have given way to commercial complexes, multi-storied buildings. You now have the freight corridor, the Mumbai-Delhi freight corridor going through Dhanu. You've got the coastal highway going through Dhanu. You've got the bullet train freight going through Dhanu. And that whole taluka is just being crisscrossed with urbanization. You would have one argument saying that, wow, this is the development story of India. This is growth, this is development, we are expanding. Let me give you some statistics on the other side of the coin. There was a time where Dhanu was the chiku basket of India. 8 out of every 10 chikus that were sold in India came from the small little taluka in Maharashtra. Today, chiku production has dropped by 60%. The vegetables of Vangam have dropped. You have so many pest attacks. So you've got a huge pest attack of the coconut trees, where essentially the crown gets infected and the whole crown just drops off. So you've got a lot of pest attacks. So on the other hand, you look at decrease in fruit production, you look at decrease in vegetable production, and you look at complete, massive land use change. So suddenly now, you've got an expanding city. You're crushing every last green lung, every last green area that is there. And finally, at some point, we're going to have to sit up and realize, hey, we can't eat concrete. So then you talk about this huge problem of urbanization, mass migration, that is going to have a lot of environmental and social repercussions as well, where you've got a lot of tribal land being converted. So these are two sides of the coin. These are questions we need to ask ourselves. Is this the only development model that we want to follow? Or do we want to start having a narrative now on sustainable development? Which then brings us to a point where what is the carrying capacity of our planet, which is finite. We have finite resources. So if we are beyond the carrying capacity, because here is a species, a mammalian species, all of us, who utilizes a lot of natural resources to survive, and we're a creature of comfort. So we use so much more. And as recently the Pope also said, we need to cure ourselves of this virus called consumerism. Because as a species, can this planet support us as a species, which is consuming far more than it can replenish? And these are the sort of questions that we need to think about as we talk about development, the effects of development, again, on human health, because this entire discussion, again, we are having with a very human lens. I do not want to divert, but really we are sharing this planet with other species who we are interdependent on. So when we start talking about, bee populations, and we think, what's it if the bee population globally just is decimated? Well, they are your greatest pollinators. So now you've again got to start thinking about technology, and now you've got little mechanical bees that are being used to artificially pollinate our crops. I mean, these are tough questions. We all need to sit up and think really, where are we heading? And the impact it's going to have on human health, quality of life as well. So these are difficult questions. Yeah. I don't have the answers.
Yeah. I mean, so like Rashneh has been talking about, that the yields of the crop yields are decreasing heavily. And also in 2019, the Lancet report also talked about how, this lack of nutrition is going to be one of the key drivers for diseases. Could you tell us the impact about this?
So I think there are no two sides to that. Nutrition has always been considered as a very important social determinant of health. You can't have good health without nutrition. And just to cap what Rashneh said also, just a couple of days ago, there was an article in the Times of India which talked about most states are facing nutrient deficiency in the soil, and particularly the highest on the list is Maharashtra. Yeah, for some reason that you overuse of pesticides and the thing, constant sort of having 3 crops a year and not giving the soil enough rest and so on. But India is faced with 2 nutritional epidemics today at the moment. One is undernutrition, which we all are familiar with, caloric undernutrition, protein deficiencies, micronutrient deficiencies, and so on. And these have been classically and conventionally linked to infections and a lack of immunity. You have connections of nutrition with tuberculosis. For instance, 38% of TB people are TB persons because they are undernourished. You have helminthic infections, you have various types of viral infections, and so on. That's one type of undernutrition. And if your immunity is affected by undernutrition, then you're not even able to respond to the drugs that are given to you. So that's a sort of a linkage with the drug resistance that you see. We don't understand quite how, but we do know that if you're well nourished, you are able to respond to drugs better. Then the other type of epidemic we have is the obesity nutritional epidemic. And we think of that as a lifestyle induced because you eat a lot of sweets and then you don't exercise enough, and that's the thing. But you also need to realize that pollution itself is obesogenic. Pollution has this effect, again, mechanisms still quite unknown, but it exacerbates glycemic products in the human body. It also brings about a metabolic syndrome. You have deviant lipid levels, and you also have hypertension.
Sorry, can I just ask, is this all pollution or it's air pollution in particular?
It's air pollution in particular. It's air pollution in particular, but as far as we know at the moment. Okay. But it could be other forms of pollution. There hasn't been too much research. But air pollution is definitely obesogenic also thing. And in terms of children particularly, the government claims that there is about 75 to 80% of complete immunization in the country. It's not so. Government's own statistics are now showing recently, which has been denied by the Ministry of Health, but it's about 60 to 65% complete immunization. So without the protective effect of immunization, children still come down with that unholy triad of measles, diarrhea, pneumonias, and so on. So that has profound, undernutrition has profound health effects, whereas overnutrition, along with the air pollution, contributes to the whole non-communicable diseases of diabetes, hypertension, lipid problems, and so on. One thing I would just like to point, which is not very well recognized, is that if you have a bacterium or a virus that actually affects a person who is undernourished or is vulnerable, then what happens is that bacteria and the virus become much more virulent. So when they infect the next host, they are much more virulent. And we've seen a change in virulence over the years in diseases like tuberculosis, where 25, 30 years ago, the bug was quite innocuous. It caused disease, yes, but not of a very virulent type or a tissue-damaging type. Today, that same bug is extremely more virulent, and that's because it's been passaged through generations of vulnerable people who are undernourished or vulnerable in some ways. And that's something. And of course, the other point is that people who get affected by undernutrition are also people who are otherwise housing vulnerabilities there. If you see Dhaka, apparently it's around the sea rim. It's always the poor people who are occupy the margins of the sea rim. So they are more open to sort of flooding that comes about with the rising sea levels and so on. So they have biological pollution, which takes place because their sanitation is poor in some of these illegal slums and so on. And on top of that, then they have this other disease burdens that are coming there. And of course, the sea rise flooding also is a major question now that the world is facing, which sea rise is about, they anticipate in this century will be about anything from about 0.5 meters to 2 meters. So that's pretty significant. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. I had actually, several years ago, done a documentary on climate change refugees in Bangladesh. So we went to the Sundarbans where literally, and we were, in the Brahmaputra, there's lovely islands which are really rich and fertile. And so people want to live there because they used to traditionally grow a lot of their crop there. But while I was there, and I'm not joking, literally it would just be eroded in front of our eyes. Like not just a foot, but literally like there would be about 6 feet of land that would just fall away into the river in front of our eyes, which we could, it's very dramatic for filming, but these are people's lives and these are people's homes. And we used to see, literally people carrying the roofs of their homes on boats, looking for another island to go to. But tell me...
But that's happening on the west coast of India as well.
Yeah.
So if you look at the coast of Gujarat, Maharashtra, a lot of our coastal towns, if you look at Udwada, if you look at that entire belt,
there's a lot of erosion. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
So all these things that you've just talked about, and also there's a quote which I have to read out by you, which says that... when you're talking about drug-resistant TB, you say, India will lose this battle at great cost. So are our public health systems, are they able to handle this currently, and what is going to happen?
Yeah. So in terms of this remark that I made, it was largely in terms of tuberculosis, in terms of finding out, which is the series of drugs which a bug is sensitive to or resistant to, and then giving the right treatment. If you don't do that, you're going to have problems. People don't realize that there are 2 types of drug resistance. One is that happens when there is a change in the target which the drug is attacking. That's one type of resistance. But there's also a more rapid type of resistance that is there, antimicrobial resistance. And that happens when organisms belonging to different families pass on their drug-resistant genes to each other, what is called a horizontal transfer of resistance. And that happens much more faster, particularly when you have environmental pollution.
Okay.
So in terms of recognizing these paradigms, I think there is a lack of competency in the public health system to understand this evolution of resistance as it goes along in the country. The public health system is rather on the back foot. It's reactive rather than proactive, I would say. Firstly, because it has a severe lack of personnel. You have about, say, doctor to patient ratio of 1:1,000. That's propagated by the WHO, but here we have 1:10,000, almost 10 times less number of doctors. And in terms of the laboratory structure, which can actually diagnose these diseases in the right way, particularly these very exotic viruses, viral infections that are coming along because of climate change. 23 different viral diseases have been so far notified in the last 20 years. And by the time the people build immunity to that, it will take some years before herd immunity builds up.
This is in India or everywhere?
It's in India.
This is in India?
It's in India, yeah. So we have also no labs that can undertake long-term toxicity studies. We have 143 labs, out of which only 3 are government, and only one of them is able to take up, which is accredited to take up long-term toxicity studies. And also, of course, I think in terms of the health risks and agriculture part of it, knowledge of farmers in terms of they experience climate change. They're quite destitute. So I think the high number of suicides and the mental health problems that we see in our farmers is largely also due to the lack of this knowledge that they have and how they can be helped to get that knowledge and mitigate the risks that they face in their day-to-day agricultural practices. I think that's extremely important.
So a question to both of you, but I'll direct it to Rashneh first, is what do you feel are the issues of equality and social justice that come into play when you're talking about climate effects on public health?
I think it's undeniable that the poor face
Much more.
the brunt of climate change. They are the marginalized community. They do not have the financial resources to adapt to climate change. They do not have access to robust public healthcare systems and services. So I think the poor most certainly suffer the most. And that's also a reason why India hides behind the poor. So if you look at India's emission, we're often saying, the developing countries are larger emitters. Look at the US, look at China. You've got the Union Minister for Environment, Javadekar, saying, hold up a mirror to yourselves. But the truth is, if you look at the elite Indian and their carbon footprint, it is at par with the US carbon footprint. Our consumption patterns, if you look at the lifestyle, it is at par. But when you look at a per capita average, it's the rich hiding behind the poor, because the poor's carbon footprint is literally negligible. So I think certainly we're hiding behind the poor. They're facing the brunt of it. And if you look at our National Action Plan on climate change, we came out with 8 missions, and you've got one for solar, the solar mission, clean water mission, green mission. They started off with 8 missions, and this was in 2008. It was under the Prime Minister at that time, Manmohan Singh. They subsequently, the review committee had a look at it and said, hey, we need to add 4 more commissions, health being one of it. And it was so important when they started making those linkages. But today, 4 days ago, you've got our Union Minister, again, Mr. Javadekar, who makes a statement that there is no link between air pollution and human health. And you just wonder, if in that seat of power you can make that statement and you truly believe it, then what sort of health system are you going to improve? And when you talk about climate refugees, if you look at the effects of air pollution, you look at water pollution as well. Look at what's happening to our groundwater tables. Look at what's happening to surface water. If you look at the sort of deaths, 200,000 deaths due to diarrhea and cholera, essentially because of limited access to clean water, which is usually stagnant water. So in rural India, it's access to stagnant water. Your photographs, very well showed that. So I think they will suffer the most. Today, we can afford to buy a bottle of water if there is limited clean water. They will not. So I think, unfortunately, they will suffer the most, but finally, everyone will. And our health system is just not geared up. If you do not even believe that there is no linkage, you're not going to start preparing for 20 years down, 50 years down the lane.
Would you like to?
Yes. So unfortunately, I think one of the major hallmarks of our health system, public health system particularly, is denial. So the first step is always denial before they actually face the very big consequences. And just like to extend something that Rashneh said about the footprint of the rich versus the poor. And even in terms of utilization of resources, the rich per capita per day consumption of water, just water, is about over 300 liters a day, which is equivalent to Western consumption, whereas the poor person living in the villages and the slum, it's hardly about 10 to 25 liters, if at all it's there. So, absolutely.
Our wards do not get equitable distribution of municipal water supply.
Yeah.
There are some wards that will get an average of 250 liters per person per day. Wards that have more slums is as low as 70 liters per water per day.
Yeah.
So that is social equity for you, where the municipal corporation does not equally distribute water across every ward in the city.
Yeah. And the problem is that the people who are well off and comfortable are very least likely to change. So if you are a rich country, and that goes for countries, between countries as well as within a country, people who are comfortable and can sort of have the paying parity to be able to buy themselves comfort, they will not make any behavioral change in terms of their consumption habits at the moment. And this is true, as I said, of countries as it is of societies. And basically, I think we need to always have health plans for vulnerable people, particularly who are more at risk. And these are things like sewer cleaners who are sent down sewers to clean with those noxious gases. We never think of them as to what is the health outcome of these people. Miners, for instance, you showed the weavers who constantly have the inhalation of these fine fibers. I remember in the old days, Sasmira, which is down the road at Worli, had a huge number of TB cases. And in miners too, in the states of Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, and even Maharashtra, eastern Maharashtra, there's a huge amount of TB in the miners. So when the national average is 250 per 100,000, there is, and the shipbuilding yards in Alag in Gujarat, huge amount because of the dust that comes from constantly breathing in the dust, which makes the lungs very vulnerable to TB. And as I said before, the poor are forced to live in these vulnerable areas and do these jobs to earn a daily living. And also there is social justice even in housing, for instance, healthy housing that is being talked about. And I'm glad to see Mr. Sir Shirish Patel in the audience here. And in terms of healthy housing, some of the slum redevelopment housing that is built in the city are really sort of death traps for people who come down with a whole heap of respiratory diseases. And there has been some newspaper articles on that too. And that's because of the fact that it's unhealthy architectural design, poor sanitation, all coupling together to give a huge disease combination, I think. And even so, I think with the consumerist patterns that are there as role models of the rich, the poor will also attempt to follow those role models. So they will also not change their habits very easily if they get recourse to the same amenities. So, for instance, they will continue to use fossil fuel transport, they will continue to smoke cigarettes, they will continue to eat junk food, because that's a role model that's given by the rich to the poor. And their understanding of climate change is extremely poor, as it is of pollution and pollution-related effects. So I said awareness generation to this class of vulnerable people, I think, is one of the most important jobs that anyone can do to actually explain to them incrementally how was their health compromised through these consumption habits and various technologies. Yeah.
But unfortunately, fast food is still the cheapest.
Absolutely.
So if you look at even health patterns in the US, if you look at your Mac economics,
that's right.
Fast food, because it's processed, high shelf life, so highly chemicalized, it's also the cheapest. So invariably, the poor will always. And that has a whole range of health effects.
Yeah.
There was what you said about how the poor will also try and do the same things as the rich. I was in a village in MP, and there were two young women from the village community who were going door to door to ask every household what is their water consumption. And they found themselves, so this is not something that we have told them. They said as soon as somebody gets piped water, their consumption just shoots up, like 10x to what they used to use traditionally. So it's the same thing. Suddenly you have access, and then you can just leave the tap running, and it's not a problem. So, yes, so I think we've sort of touched upon this, but I would like to talk about it a little bit more. The government has adopted the National Action Plan for Climate Change and Human Health, under which environmental cells in the health department at state and district level are in the process of being established to monitor the effects of environment change on public health. Is this enough?
No. As I mentioned, unfortunately, it isn't enough, because very little is being done. If you look at the healthcare system in India today, and I'll leave that to Nerges, but it's really dealing with the immediate. And barely is it coping. It's crumbling. It can't deal with the immediate problems. There is no... Literally, there is no communication between these missions. So everything is in silos. Health will only look at primary healthcare systems. They will not talk to the solar mission, because it's like, hey, what has renewable energy got to do with health? And they won't talk to water. And like, okay, we just need access to water. So I think it's very compartmentalized. No one is looking at the holistic picture of it, and I do not think the sort of financial resources that are needed are today being pumped into health and public health systems. So if you look at health, it's also being privatized. Are we looking at our public health systems? Barely can we cope with the immediate that we're going to talk about, climate change. So I do not think enough is being done.
Yeah. One of the things I think it needs to be told that this National Clean Air Program, which the Prime Minister announced in 2019, is to reduce particulate matter by 20 to 30% by the year 2024. I think all elimination programs seem to be centered around 2024 for some reason, so you can work it out. So anyway, I think one thing is good is that the government has at least linked environmental pollution with climate change and health, which
until 4 days ago.
Until 4 days ago, yeah. That's
I actually thought you were going to say they've linked it to elections.
Take your pick, for that. Yeah, that's there. But in terms of actually having this whole national action plan, and so you need data for that. You need data and you need research. Yeah, and the problem is the method for collecting data. Let's take it for the emissions. So you need these little towers that actually measure emission. In Mumbai, there are 6 such towers, out of which 4 have been robbed of several components, and they're almost dysfunctional. Some areas may have something like maybe 40 or 50. In most areas in India, it's very patchy. There are cities that have these particulate matter counters, but somewhere there is none at all. So there are huge gaps in national level data. And the ability to model the risk assessment from that data that's even sparsely collected is just not there. The competencies are not there at all in our thing. So how the government is actually going to form a national action plan based on patchy and primary level, lack of primary level data is one big question. And it's not enough now because of the fact that climate change and pollution is getting into almost existentialist proportions. Everything is threatened quite severely. So how they're going to do it in these various geographies is really hard to look at. Yeah. Also, the labs, as I said, are few and far in between. Ability of the labs is also very iffy, and so on. But it's also very important, because it's so urgent, to accelerate the pace of action. So the Lancet Countdown now talks about accelerating the pace of action, reducing carbon emissions and all by 7.6% every year, so that the carbon footprint is negative by the year 2050. Yeah? And how are you going to do that? You require to monitor the progress, what you're doing. Is it really working or not working? So research that monitors progress is something that needs to be actually emphasized if the National Climate Action Plan or the climate change or even the Clean Air Program is to become a reality. Yeah.
Were you going to say something?
Yeah. I think it means moving away from fossil fuel-based economy. And until that happens, that truly is the root cause. So you can monitor, you'll get all the data, but I think we need this huge tangential shift away from just fossil fuel-based growth models.
Yeah.
Why don't you, I'd like you to speak about solar and some of your solar projects, because I think most of us just feel that it's prohibitively expensive and it doesn't actually generate the kind of energy that we require. So it would be good to actually hear when you're speaking about renewables.
So one of the projects undertaken by my organization, the Center for Environmental Research and Education, is known as Schools on Solar, SOS. The time has come, where we are helping educational institutions, schools, low-income schools start adopting solar energy, renewable energy, and moving away from fossil fuel-based energy. And through this program, many schools have converted. And if you look at the progress of solar technology today, what used to be a return on investment, a few years ago the ROIs were about 8 to 9 years. Today, with the advances in technology, it has come down to 4 years. And now the durability of the panels is so good that good top-of-the-line panels are giving warranties for 25 years. So on one hand, you've got free electricity from your 5th year onwards, and on the other hand, you've got accelerated rates on fossil fuel-based electricity. So solar certainly is the way forward. It's not the only silver bullet that's going to solve your climate crisis, but it certainly is this transitional step, first step away from from fossil fuel-based electricity. So the program that we've started, just 5 schools that, to give you an example, we have saved over 28,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide. And this is just 5 schools that have converted to solar. And they will be saving over, and I've got these figures, I don't want to get it wrong, over 1.19 lakh units of electricity. And we hope that more and more educational institutions start moving on to renewable energy, because from the savings, they also help improve the educational infrastructure in that school. And these projects are being supported by companies through their CSR program. So it's beneficial to both the companies who benefit from the carbon value and the school that has financial savings. There is a very strong educational component where we start educating the children on the connections between renewable energy and climate change. They can look upon it as a career, and they become the next solar engineers. And it's really joining these dots for solar energy and adopting it in the future.
Yeah, so I'd just like to say something on reducing the spending on fossil fuels. India in the last couple of years has been spending more on fossil fuels, and the minister also has declared in Parliament that they need to actually increase the investment for fossil fuels.
Sorry, spending more on fossil fuels since...
Coal, thermal energy. Yeah.
Than in the previous
years. Yes, that's right. So, and just to back up what Rashneh says, so an IMF report states that per unit of energy, solar is a cheaper form of energy, and she gave the thing about the return of investments, and the costs can drop further, and renewable energy jobs can also be generated in India. So one of the suggestions that's been given by economists is that increase the coal cess, that's the tax, to rupees 5,000 per ton of coal produced by 2030, and from the current measly amount of rupees 400 per ton thing. And this, apparently, they project that this will drop air pollution deaths to 40% by 2030. So this is a projection made by the IMF. And coal cess can lead to, of course, increased expenditure on electricity. That can be channelized to wealthy populations who can pay for that expensive, whereas the poor can get the benefit of cheap solar energy. And government needs revenue to assist in clean energy transition. modernizing transmission grids so that the loss is minimal, because that's where electricity costs because of the enormous loss that goes across transmission grids, and fostering domestic production of the solar panels instead of relying on those that are imported. But as Rashneh said also, I think more than the solar, apart from the solar, there are lots of other steps also what can do to mitigate this effect. So eliminate short-lived pollutants like methane and hydrofluorocarbons from all the things. Even if you're using coal, use filters that actually filter out the noxious gaseous emissions that come about. Improve the thermal technologies to an extent. India's thermal coal technologies are outdated, actually. Preserve ecosystems as best as possible, coral reefs, grasslands, forests, and so on. And they, along with marine and land animals, play a crucial role in carbon cycling and storage. That's well known. Prevent melting of the polar ice. And some bright innovator has also suggested that you pulverize glass and then you spread it through an airplane across the polar glaciers so that the glass crystals actually deflect the sun's rays and prevent the glaciers from melting. These are sort of things that people are trying out. And if all of you are not vegetarians yet, please turn vegetarian, because that prevents livestock breeding. And you can save that food which you use for livestock breeding for human consumption, and so on. And of course, you did mention the Earth is a finite place, and we are also one of the species that live in it, so reduce unsustainable population growth is also a message.
No, I think that's a great place to actually stop, because I have been signaled that we have to now open it up for questions. So please go ahead and ask. Yes, great.
As I know, Rashneh knows, the production of the solar panels is not an easy thing. It creates huge pollution. We have to use less. And the other elephant in the room is it taboo to talk about population control, which is the cause of everything. You have given the results, not the cause.
I agree. As I said, solar is the one transitional step because we still haven't closed the loop. So it isn't, it's still cradle to grave. We're still looking for alternatives for silica, silica being a natural mineral. So yes, it is not that silver bullet, but I think it is far better than coal. We are looking at it as a transitional step. And as for your second point, I totally agree. I mean, if you look at the UN projection, by 2023, the population is going to touch 8 billion. So you're looking at, absolutely, population is the root cause of a lot of the problems. I fully agree.
Nerges, you mentioned that the cost of reducing carbon emissions might be about 1% of
the global GDP.
Of the global GDP. Even if it were, I think it might be an underestimate, but even if it were 2 or 3% of global GDP,
would still be trivial.
It's still trivial. Now, what is the cost of not doing anything? I suspect that it wasn't the case earlier, but now that cost is significantly higher. And if we measure that, and that is rising, whereas the other cost is likely to come down over time as technology improves.
Yes.
And there's lots of technology improvement.
That's right.
Even fossil fuels don't have to be written off.
That's right.
Because there are recent new techniques in enhanced oil recovery,
That's right,
whereby you put much more carbon dioxide in the oil recovery process than you will emit when you burn the oil.
That's right.
And you put the carbon dioxide out first. In Japan, they're producing hydrogen in Australia from lignite. But all the carbon dioxide that comes as a byproduct is immediately sequestered.
That's right.
So there are all sorts of technologies we could use. I think if we make the case that not doing anything is far more expensive than doing something, we could convince the world. The cost is low. The problem is it's beyond the politicians' time horizon, as you mentioned. They aren't interested. And the cost is low if it is evenly divided over everybody. If one person takes the initiative, he suffers that cost without getting much benefit.
That's right. Yeah.
had a quick question.
Is there anybody else who had a hand?
I'll be quick. A lot of attention has understandably been put on Delhi, given its... There's been a lot of attention focused on Delhi, given it's at 400 AQI today, and it's gotten far worse as well. But I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the health implications of people living in cities like Mumbai or Calcutta, which are regularly in the 140 to 180 range, barring the monsoon. Yeah. Maybe someone who has a purifier at home, maybe not. What does that concretely mean? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think Delhi has grabbed most of the attention because of the smog and with the stubble burning and the crackers, which comes about at this time of the year. And I think Rashneh has looked at that But there is almost equal amount of pollution in many of the cities. And as I said, six most polluted cities in India out of the 10 in the world are from India. So I think the situation is not too different. It's only Delhi has grabbed the attention because it's being the political capital and so on. But I think people also relate smog with pollution. Bright blue skies also have just as much pollution as smoggy cities, really, and that's not very well appreciated. So I think in terms of respiratory diseases, we see evidence of it in many, many cities. Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Pune, all the cities have been hit with this health problem and so on. Yeah. So air purifiers or any technology is good as a sort of a mitigating thing, but it's iniquitous technology because it can only be used by a certain segment of the population. Yeah. And in fact, like for instance, I'm so glad we have a jug and glasses here rather than plastic water bottles, because plastic water bottles, as Rashneh said, or drugs for that matter. Drugs are also a sort of a mitigating sop when actually the cause of the disease is something different. Yeah, so the less attention is paid to prevention, more to the curative side of it. So also drugs in a way mitigate a certain sort of problem, and they take away the attention from the root cause of disease. But I think the pollution is pretty much uniform all across India. There are certain pockets, because of their geographic location, are prone to more, but more or less in terms of emissions and so on, it's a nationwide story. Yes, I think those standards are there. Those standards are there for most of the emissions, except for nanoparticles. Nanoparticles are actually, as I said, the worst of the lot because they're very, very tiny, and they just don't sit in the lungs like the particulate matter. They actually travel in the bloodstream and create a lot of problem. Only for nanoparticles, the standards are not set as to what level causes disease. Yeah, but for all the others, yeah, we do have. And that's why this whole air quality index, etc.
Okay. Hi. So my question is simple. You both spoke about how it's really hard to quantify when it comes to, like, for example, air pollution. As long as people are not seeing the effects of what's there in the air, they're okay with it. They'll go on with it. Like in Delhi, you'll wear masks and go on. My simple question is, how do you really get people interested in how do you get them to change? Because I guess change is the only way that we're going to be able to tackle this 20 years down the line, 50 years down the line. How do you bring change to every household, every small community unit? And if you will have more examples like your solar project, I'd really like to know about those examples.
Okay. So I think public awareness is the way forward. Formal education. So really informing the child as they're growing up, so that when they take this knowledge into their personal and professional lives when they grow up. So definitely formal education, and I think that is happening. I think 2 generations before us possibly never had heard of climate change and global warming. Today, young children are aware of it. They're concerned about it. You can see a Greta who has brought the world on its knees. They're sitting up and talking because finally it's that generation that's going to have to deal with the problems that we have created today. They're going to have to be far more innovative, more adaptive. So education, if you want to know some of our programs, we do have a website, but I think even the adult population needs to be engaged through multiple channels. So I know the corporate world engages with their employees, and there is a lot of awareness being spread by the corporate world on the sort of CSR projects that they are undertaking, formal education. If you look at our newspapers, look at our newspapers today. A few years ago, they weren't carrying as many articles. Now, because the frequency of natural disasters, because the frequency of disease outbreaks are so much, every day you open the paper, There will be a newspaper article on climate change and global warming. But I think we need to move beyond awareness. It comes down to action. We do not have the luxury of time. So I think we need to be in a mode of combat. Here is a problem that we need to combat. There needs to be action, and that has to happen at many layers. We cannot just leave it to the government because the politicians may or may not. I think as communities, we now need to be more vocal. As a consumer base, we need to make choices. And I think it comes down a lot to the personal level, where we start making those changes, tough changes. Changing, as Nerges said, are we changing the way we eat? Are we changing the way we dress? Are we changing every aspect of our lives? And I think only then will you see a ripple effect, only then will that multiplication effect come into play, and we can see mass change. So I think a lot is also the public changing and wanting to do so.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. I would say in terms of the individual, I think there are 3 mantras: conserve, recycle, and innovate. I think that's something that can be done at the individual and even at the societal level. And as my old boss used to tell me, don't be a specialist, always be a generalist. So you see the wider picture. Yeah, I think Rashneh's thing of linking the dots is very important. And you can only do that if you are not completely deep down in your own discipline and looking at some nitty-gritty. It's better if you look at a wider picture. So be a generalist and try to learn the links between various issues. The other thing is, as an individual or as a society or a community, mobilize and be mobilizable. Yeah. So there is a lady called Gail Bradbrook. You might have heard of her, some of you. She's a molecular physicist, and she did an interesting experiment. Concerned about climate change and pollution and all the rest of the issues, she got together a whole group of people, behavioral scientists, physicists, and so on, and then and sociologists, and then they debated for days together as to what's the best way to engender change in the community or behavioral change. And the one conclusion they came about almost unanimously was civil disobedience. Yeah. It's not a platform that one would like to propagate, but they said that that was the only way they felt, it's their opinion, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but their opinion was that only a mass movement with civil disobedience can bring about the change that we want to see in terms of people who can actually take and invest in action. And learn to demand and monitor implementation, any form of implementation. Don't take it for granted. We very often do a lot of things without monitoring really what's their effect and what it's causing. And I'd just like to say the last thing is Gitti, the German philosopher and poet and statesman. He says, knowledge is not enough, we must apply. And willing is not enough, we must do.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a very enlightening discussion. I would say it was rather than pertinent, imminent for our times to come. Thank you so much, panel. I have 2 questions, actually. Taking a cue from what you have been saying for answering the earlier question, like informed decision making can only come after when the discourse is more informed. There has always been a challenge that how do you translate science to public discourse? That's right. So are there any strategies have you come across? Because when you translating science to public discourse, it has been a challenge, and how do we do it in India, especially when we're just budding to discuss climate change and public health? Because this is a subject that's not spoken about.
That's
and
right.
in our lifetime, we are going to face this. So that's a massive challenge. The second thing is, in a bit of, if I beg to differ from the idea that, of course, it's a very debatable idea about civil disobedience, I want to ask you, do you think our governance institutions are rather disused or not used adequately enough, because of which we usually tend to talk about movements? I'll give you an example. our committee systems where we elect politicians, ministers, and members of parliament or MLAs, they are not used as much when you look at Canada, the United States, where they have public hearings on discourses of climate change, public health. So we are not using them enough, wherein we are holding government to account, where we have informed decision making. Do you think that's one of the reasons, or would you like to elaborate on?
Yeah.
It's an open question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So two very interesting.
One last question, and then you can answer again.
Right. Okay. Fine.
So my question is actually a follow-up to a comment that was mentioned during the panel discussion about the availability of reliable national as well as state-level estimates, specifically around air pollution. Now, in the past couple of years, there have been efforts around India to get at this, specifically through the Global Burden of Disease and the India State-Level Initiative. I suppose my question is, how do we get such efforts to not just vanish into the ether? Because, you know, it was a large involvement with both government and civil society, and it still continues to be. So how can a lot of this data be used to drive action? Thank you.
Yeah. So, if I may answer the question on science communication, being a scientist, I have to say right at the onset that scientists are usually extremely poor communicators. I mean, they get caught up in their jargon and so on. And therefore, the science which actually needs to be explained in a simplified manner is just not there. Yeah, it becomes too complicated for public discourse or for people to understand. And science is all about debate and discussion and so on, and that often confuses the lay public. Is milk good or bad? You know, every 10 years the decision has been changing. Or is vitamin D good for immunity or not too good for immunity? That also keeps on changing, these sort of debates that go on. So I think we need to use our journalists to a great degree to be able to explain to the mass as to how, because they're used to communication to the masses, and use them to actually convey the messages that science wants to reach to people for various issues related to climate change and pollution. So science communication is something that's extremely important, and I think this discipline is also growing in recent years. It actually came about with the HIV epidemic, where how data was presented to the public actually managed to engender sufficient finance to tackle the HIV epidemic. So I think, yes, thank you. That was a very important point you brought up. In terms of governance, I agree with you that we have not used our governance structures enough to be able to convince convince the politicians that be of climate change. There's a group of parliamentarians who are cutting across party lines who are interested in health issues, and I have interacted with them in terms of at least tuberculosis. And I find a lot of response in them wanting to understand really what the problem was and so on. So perhaps, yes, I think you're right, instead of writing off government completely and looking at mass movements. But these are all push and pull things. You need mass movements. You also require to educate the parliamentarians and the politicians, those who are interested in the effects of climate change or pollution and all. And I think if one learns the communication strategy, I think that would definitely help. Thank you for bringing out these two most important points.
And if I could add, India does not have a Green Party. Doesn't that tell us a lot on how our politics is playing out? What are the important issues that politicians or India is talking about? I think today the narrative in India is still about development. Why are people, they're still voting for development. They are not voting for the environment. I'm not going to go into party politics, but I think, we really need to ask ourselves whether we can wait to have this political discourse, because climate change is not waiting for anyone. We are talking about a population a large population of India, the poor are still wondering where is their next meal going to come from. They aren't doing the sort of 5-year planning. So I do not, yes, political discourse and making popular science wider is important, but I do not think that is going to solve a lot of our climate issues. So that's what I think. We really need to sometimes not wait. Let's start taking action. Let's not wait for politicians to decide our future. I think it comes down to individuals, it comes down to communities, and sometimes the communities may know no better, but are you not going to change the system? Are you going to wait that no, unless we have consensus, we will not undertake certain programs? I do not think we have that sort of luxury of time.
We had a question here about the disease, the global burden of disease, and how all that does not go into ether, if I understand the question correctly, and what do you do? And it's basically you need to, I think as the title quite rightly says, the science is pretty clear. We know what the things are, and the disease burden just keeps on growing from day to day to day. But how do you take action against it in terms of individuals have limited capacity to undertake certain actions. Government has far more reach, or political parties have far more reach to be able to facilitate those actions and so on. Again, it's a question, I think, of coming back to the last question, is the question of communication. How do you actually communicate it urgently? But it needs a communication dialogue as to how to get a transponder to take action with the evidence that's generated. And I think these global burden of disease reports and epidemiology certainly helps in flagging what the health problems are and what you need to do in health planning and so on. But I think these disciplines also need to be actually built up. How do you use this evidence for translation into action? I think that competencies also need to be there. How do you actually translate evidence into action? Yeah.
Take one more question, or?
I want to say some very pertinent thing that you are not covered. That is EMF RF radiation, which is creating cancer.
What's that?
That is our mobile radiation.
Yes, the mobile radiation. Yes, of course.
Which is the biggest killer of causing cancer.
You're right.
And that beach that she is talking about, I don't know, is talking about, that is lost. Is because of this EMF RF radiation.
Awesome.
And now we are going to have a 5G, which will be creating much more problem for that. You see that persons have getting more cancer, and they are also not having reproducing capabilities, also getting lost because of this mobile. You are just keeping it in your pocket.
That's right.
And I can show you that how it affects you. You can show it, put it in your hand, and I can show you that how it affects the.
Sorry. Yes. Thank you.
I quite agree.
Yeah.
Another thing that you have not covered is the Monsanto.
Yeah. I think there's so many things. It's there's a very wide. Yeah. Absolutely. But just want to say thank you very much. It's been a really great conversation, and I think, we've opened up so much more than just talking about issues that are pertinent to all of us, but we don't delve deep enough often into it. So I'm glad that everyone's given this hour and a half to listen, and thank you very much for that.